So today we are going to be background, but my husband built a tool for me as a result of the work that I was doing within a school district. I saw a lot of the folks that are sending in your messages about the things that you're doing in your districts, and I work in a very small district, and I see one of my neighboring district people, Mary Larson from Judah, you're on today. So when you're in a small district, there's a lot of different hats that you have to wear. So the product that my husband developed for me was just simply a favor so that I could get back to working with kids. So today's presentation, you're going to see a little bit of the screenshots from that tool, but that's not the focus of today's talk. It's really about making sure that we're aligning those interventions and knowing which interventions we need to put in place for students, and then critically evaluating whether or not those interventions are in fact effective. So those are all different things that I did within the district, and just wanted to share a little bit about my background. And was a 504 coordinator, early childhood coordinator. You kind of do a lot of different things. So happy to see so many people from different capacities within your district. So thanks for joining today. So what we're going to be talking about, we're going to start with a baseline of what MTSS is. It's always good to start out and have that foundational understanding. So talking through how MTSS can really help support our students as well as just our infrastructure within the school district. It's always important to start by discussing the things that we're putting in place for all students, which is at the Tier 1 level. So we'll discuss a little bit about that at the very beginning here. From there, we'll move into the Tier 2 and Tier 3 types of interventions and supports. So as students' needs become more intense, our interventions and supports should then align to the level of need that students have. So we often do that intensification at the Tier 2 and Tier 3 levels. So kind of looking at the data that you might want to use within your district and think about how you can effectively identify and support the students at both the Tier 2 and Tier 3 levels. From there, we'll discuss how we can evaluate effectiveness, not only for the individual student, but what's also critically important is that we do that for the intervention itself, as well as overall the programs that we have in place for supporting our students. And like Lynn said at the very end here, we'll make sure that we leave some time for answering any questions that you might have. So feel free to throw those into the chat as we go through here. So starting out with our basic foundational, definition of what MTSS is. So it is a framework that we put in place that is going to be tiered in order to really put things in place in an infrastructure. So thinking about making sure that we're aligning both the academic and those social, emotional, behavioral assessments that we have to the actual resources and the ways that we can instruct and teach our students to really make sure that we're helping to support each and every student's needs. So when we, a couple years ago at Illuminate, we took a look at what was happening across the nation and spent a lot of time trying to understand what is the general framework that districts are really implementing. I know within my own district, we had bits and pieces of this working. What we found is that though things varied across the nation, the districts who we've seen have most success have these 5 main components in place. And those things are starting with the inviting school climate and culture. When kids feel safe, when our staff feels safe, they know what to expect, we see greater outcomes. When our district leaders and the people in our schools are supporting the initiatives that we have, leadership is a very integral part of ensuring that MTSS can kind of hit the ground running and that we can have greater outcomes for students. From there, it's very important that with that leadership that we are also putting in place the infrastructure and making sure that we're very intentional about aligning the different resources we have within the school. So basically taking the time and allocating time within our days to make sure that we can analyze data and that we're putting supports in place for our staff to get professional development opportunities. And then making sure that we have, decision rules and such identified. So being very intentional about how we're actually supporting and kind of aligning our resources within the school district. It's also really important that we're engaging with our parents and our students and guardians, as well as some community key stakeholders. So those things are really important for making sure that we're connecting with all folks when we see that students have needs. And then where we spend most of our time and where we're going to be discussing today is really on making sure that we're aligning those resources that we have and the specific instruction that we're going to provide for students based on the assessment results that we have. So it's all about matching the assessment results to the instruction and to the intervention supports that we put in place. So the kind of framework that we use, right? It can't be a MTSS or RTI presentation without the lovely triangle. What I hope you notice about this, though, is that we're not only talking about academic or behavior, we're talking about also the social emotional needs that students have. So when we think about alignment of our resources and how we're going to actually roll out instruction and provide supports for students, it's important to do this. To look at the resources that we have and make sure that our universal instruction is going to be happening for 80 to 90% of the students and is effective for that number of students. We typically notice that there's about 5 to 15% of our population that needs more intensive or more strategic supports put in place at that tier 2 level. Then moving into the tier 3 level, that's where we see typically 1 to 5% of our students typically need some supports, and those are going to be those things that are the most intense. So what we see is the greater the need for the students, the more intense then our alignment should be, and our services and instruction should be. So it's as we know right now, it's always been important that our students are growing and can feel more challenging, or ensuring that our students are growing. It right now can feel more challenging and confusing than it ever has in the past, which is why we need to really lean in to MTSS because it can provide that structure where we can really rely on the framework that we've built, especially in this time of increased student need. What we know is that when things are in disarray or in a time of confusion, having frameworks and different structures in place really helps us to make sure that we're aligning and we kind of know what to do so that we're not kind of panicking. And so MTSS really does provide that framework to help ensure that all students' needs are met without relying on those unsustainable efforts. So when we think about this, we need to make sure that we're focusing on the tier 1 supports, and this is again going to address the needs of all students. And so there are three main things that you can kind of think about when we talk about universal or the tier 1 level. It's again that the resources and the instruction, that these things are available to all of the students at the tier 1 level. So that means all students are getting tier 1 instruction. It's not tier 2 and the students are missing out on tier 1. It's always important that we're providing those tier 1 universal instruction to all students, that we're trying to target to make sure that our students are achieving grade level standards and expectations. So all students we expect to be trying to achieve the standards that are aligned to the grade level that the student is in. And also at the universal level, we want to make sure that what we're doing is really meeting the needs of most of the students. So, in order for us to know whether or not we're meeting the needs of most students, we need to make sure that our instruction is in fact effective. So, it's effective when the majority of the students and our learners are successful without the need for additional intense interventions. And what we see, if you know, we've had this 80-20 rule, or if you look at data, you maybe have heard this number being thrown around. And the reason for it is because as a system in schools, we're not really built to be able to support the intensive level of needs for more than 20% of students. So that's why if we see that greater than 20% of our students have an intensive need of some sort, we should be rolling that back and say this is something that all students could likely benefit from. So when we think about how do we know what is effective, how do we figure out is tier one actually working? So there's a few different structures that can be put in place. This is a visual that I am really excited about. Lynn, who introduced me, we have worked together on this, and I love this visual that she helped me kind of come up with. So data analysis teams really are that structure when we think about that intentionally integrated infrastructure. A data analysis team is a group of people who meet for different reasons throughout the year. So what you're seeing here is we have our screening data. So with our screening data, there's a team that spends time to actually look at that data 2 to 3 times a year to evaluate the effectiveness of what we're doing for all students. And the question we ask if you have a universal data analysis team is, are the students responding to our tier one efforts? As we move and maybe we've identified who maybe um, who isn't responding to the core instruction and who needs intensive interventions. From there, we provide and we put those interventions into place. It's best practice for us then to create a different set of people who have a different reason for analyzing data. So that team is called an intervention data analysis team. That group of people are looking at progress monitoring data that we have on our students, and it can be for both students' social, emotional, behavioral needs, as well as the academic instructional needs that they might have. For students receiving those SEV supports, we recommend that every 3 weeks, the intervention data analysis team meets, and every 6 weeks if the student has more of an academic related need. And that's all about the type of monitoring that we're engaging with. And the question that we're asking there is, how is each student responding to his or her intervention? From there, this last step is one that I'm hoping that we can continue to get to across districts, wherever you're at, is to really make sure that we're taking the time to also evaluate our programs that we have in place. So it's recommended that every 12 weeks, we take a look at all of the interventions we have going on within the district to ask the question or answer the question of, are our students who are receiving tier two and tier three interventions, are they responding? And are those interventions as a whole actually effective? And then thinking about that, maybe there's something that we're identifying that with all the interventions, we still have some students who have an ongoing need of some sort. So looking at those patterns and trends, what from that can we apply then to the tier one level? So this is a great structure that I would encourage you to aim toward. If you maybe have a time and place where you're already evaluating the screening data, maybe the next bit that you could put in place is establishing that 6-week check-in with with our intervention data analysis team. Or maybe you've already got a structure for that, and the next bit of work you can do is get to that program data analysis team. Different groups of people meet for different reasons, and I'll kind of talk through a few of these different things. So, at the universal level, the purpose of this is to monitor whether or not, again, what we're doing with all students is in fact effective. And it also is a place where we are identifying the students who have those tier two and those tier three needs. The people that we tend to see that are involved in a universal data analysis team are going to be folks like our leaders. So thinking about our principals or some administrator that's going to be key to ensuring that we have the infrastructure, the services and supports available to our staff. Somebody from the administrative team should be part of that meeting. We also want to encourage that our interventionists, and by interventionists, by the way, I also would include special education teachers in that group because special education should be our most intensive intervention. Also thinking about including a school psychologist or a school counselor as part of that core group. Of course, anyone else who has a rich understanding of data analysis, some districts have an actual data analyst that they have within the district. Other districts might have somebody like an instructional coach that might be able to provide some suggestions at the universal level. And then also, of course, we want to include our general education classroom teachers in that mix. Again, we meet 3 times a year because that's when we're typically screening and we're administering a universal screener. Um, and it's also a great time for us to take a look at some of our attendance data that we have, as well as the social emotional learning or any behavioral data that we might have. So, some of those major office offenses or even minor classroom teacher referred incidents that are happening. So using all of those different data points are really helpful. But what's really going to be important is that we have identified some decision rules. So we have a game plan in place for us to kind of think through the data that we have to be able to evaluate and make decisions on the spot. So some of the questions you would want to be asking that you would then be able to provide, okay, now what part after you start analyzing your data is are at least 80% of our students meeting low risk targets. So most of the screeners that are out there have these risk levels already identified. And in this case, we're just showing you that low risk is going to be something that we'd say is the color green. And so if we see that less than 80% of our students have scores in the green range, we should be thinking about what can we do for all students. Another question you should be asking is our average score at or above the benchmark level? So again, these screeners typically have here's the cut point for risk level. When you look at the actual average score, so taking all of the students that we have and looking at the most average score, that's a great way for us to see whether or not we might need to implement what we call class-wide intervention. I'm going to throw out an intervention. I have no affiliation to it, but we used it in my own district, and I know a lot of districts have been using it. It's called PRESS. There's some great tools in there for reading specifically for class-wide intervention. So meaning universally, we've identified that there's a level of need and there's some great interventions that are out there. There's also some class-wide peer tutoring kinds of supports that are also very effective at that universal type of level. So again, thinking about what can we do for the majority of students and partnering students up with other students and putting that into a structure that makes sense, it can be really helpful. Another question you would want to ask, this would be more the winter or the spring data point, would be are 95% of the students who started the year on track, so not in the whose students' scores were in the green ranges, um, are they still on track at the end of the year? And if we see that we have a lot of students who are slipping, that means that maybe even at the higher levels, maybe we're targeting too much of our efforts at the students who have higher levels of need, and we're not doing enough to make sure that all students are having that enrichment and instruction. So using the data and asking these questions can kind of make sure that we're thinking about all the students' needs. Likewise, when we look at the students who have levels of risk, are we seeing that the students have growth rates that we would expect? So catch-up growth is something that we want to make sure that we're seeing for our students, and that's to make sure that we're enhancing or we're accelerating learning. So average growth means that students, is typical here, and at the end of the year, they grew at a typical rate. For students where we see there's a large gap, we would expect that rate of growth to be much higher. So making sure that when we look at the number here in this chart, this is one of my favorite charts, by the way, is when we take the students whose scores were at the high risk level and see at the end of the year how many of them are still having scores in the high risk range, because that tells us as a program we might not be doing everything we need to be doing to help support all students. Also taking kind of another layer look at this is to look at whether or not we see different results for different groups of students. So do we see any differences with gender? Do we see differences with students with different ethnicities? So are we making sure that we're being equitable in our approach to working with all students? And I know I've done some presentations on that in the past. I'm sure you could look that up if you're ever interested. So then, if we are looking at the data, we're thinking about asking all of those questions, and then it's the now what? What do we do, and how do we make sure that we're addressing the needs of all students at that tier one level? It's always great for us to start by celebrate what's working. So when we see that we've made gains or we see that we have a large percentage of our students who are not at risk, let's celebrate that. Take the time, especially right now, to feel like what we're doing is actually helping to support what's going on. The other thing that's really important with that, by the way, is that we can reach out to see other staff who maybe things are working very well for them, and we maybe want to learn from them. So it's important for us to always make sure we're paying not just attention to the students that are struggling or the things that aren't working, but also taking the time to acknowledge the things that are working. As you start to dig into your data a little bit deeper, it's necessary for us to take a peek at areas where we might need to focus a little bit more granularly. So, thinking about our specific skill instruction that may be an area of need, again, thinking about like that resource, the interventions that we might have for all students. In this case, if we see that according to our test results, a large number of our students have an area of need, they're all scoring low in the area of informational text, what are the things we can do to enhance that skill area for all students? And again, here are some of the different ways that you should, or the questions you should be kind of thinking about as you're working as a team and thinking about identifying the root cause for the issues. Data should, if you see a chart, you should never start and stop on that same chart. It should lead you down I call it a data journey to identify that root cause. And so continuing to drill down and dig into your data is going to be very important for making sure that we're aligning the actual needs of our students to the instruction that then they need. So the questions you can ask is making sure that we're always thinking about whether or not we're using research-based curriculum and methods to teach the skill, and that everyone is in fact, implementing and teaching based on those things that we know to be helpful for students. Um, and if we see that maybe they're not, we also need to ask the question is about whether our staff has received adequate training. So sometimes it comes down to professional development, or they're brand new. We had a new teacher that started, and they never had the time to actually learn the curriculum. That helps us to take a step back and think about, as a school system, what can we do to support our staff? And sometimes we start implementing new programs and we aren't giving adequate time to be able to learn the programs. So I already mentioned there may be a need for some professional development. I always think about too students who have social emotional needs. Sometimes it's okay for us to admit that we don't know how to handle, students who have maybe more mental health needs than previously. So recognizing where we're at and using our data to identify that and say, as a staff, we need to better understand how to support students in their mental health needs. That's another example of professional development. And all of it starts again with data. So then thinking about, I already mentioned this, but if we see that something is working really well with one of our colleagues, how could we maybe learn from that colleague? Could we have other staff go in and watch how that teacher is teaching, or ask them, what is it? How did they start doing it this way? Um, Also, is there anything that we can learn and apply from just our general areas of tier one successes? So if we're seeing things that are working, how can we can continue to make sure that we're enhancing the outcomes we're working? So thinking more critically about examining those and supporting the tier one needs that we have. Once we've identified what that root cause is, some of the possible steps that you might see, or that we see often are being implemented, are adjusting the tier one levels of needs to make sure that we're targeting specific skill gaps. So the types of adjustments we see districts making are, you're going to likely increase the frequency of the supports, increase the duration, so how long you are doing it, or maybe you're going to decrease the group size. So maybe we've got 10 kids in a group and we need to move that into a smaller group so that we can make sure the students are getting a little bit more individualized attention. I already mentioned implementing class-wide interventions. With that, what we typically see is that the teacher is spending about 15 to 20 minutes focusing on a specific skill area. We also see some districts, again, implementing peer tutoring. And not just, partnering kids up, but there's a very strategic way that you should go about matching students. So what I see often happening in districts is you take your entire population of the class and you say, of all of the students, here are their scores on this measure. The student, you basically cut the list in half. And so you take the top half of the students and the bottom half of the students according to their scores, and you match them up. So the highest of the low group would be matched with the highest of the high group, and so on all the way down the list, so that we're appropriately matching students. And then also, of course, there may be areas where as an entire staff, we need to focus our professional development. And then always, I'm huge on connecting with our students. So at the root of all of this is that we should be making sure that we're supporting the relationships and those connections that we have, not only with our students, but also with our staff, so that everyone feels like they're supported. So thinking about then our planning and how we go about setting goals at the tier one level, it's always helpful for us to kind of ground ourselves in data and use that as a way for us to identify whether what we're doing is working or not. So a question you can ask is, what goal will we aim for by our next review meeting? And again, being as specific, making sure that we have a measure, that it's attainable, it's realistic, and that there's a time component. So by this point, we want to see this percentage of our students scoring in the low risk range, would be a great example of a goal. Then from there, it's important that you list out possible strategies that are going to address that goal. So some different strategies we typically see are, making sure that the strategies that we're going to implement are going to be research based. Which ones are going to be most practical? What materials do we have available? And then which ones require additional training? So this is kind of like taking that brainstorming idea and then basically validating that it's something that we can do and that we have the time or the resources to make sure that we're not just saying we're going to do all of these things, but we don't actually have the supports in place to implement the strategies that we're suggesting. And so you do this as kind of a team, by the way, at that data analysis team after the universal screening. And again, selecting and explicitly describing the strategy is really important, because sometimes we just loosely say what we're going to do and then we don't follow up. So being as specific as we can is really important. Again, planning out the logistics. Is there a need for us to purchase something? What additional follow-up items do we have to make sure that we're actually implementing that strategy? And then, of course, we need to determine at this point, when are we going to sit back down as a team and review the next set of data so that we can review the goal and our progress toward that goal at the universal level. From there, thinking about then aligning those resources for our students at the tier 2 and tier 3 levels. By starting again with our tier 1, we've identified areas of universal need. We've created the plan to address them at the universal level, and not through individualized services or supports at the tier 2 or tier 3 levels yet. We've allocated resources, and we've said this is going to have the biggest impact. And then, of course, you're taking action that positively impacts all of our students. So with that, you can really focus on making sure that we're helping to identify and align the services at the tier 2 and tier 3 levels. So in order for us to do that, we kind of can ground ourselves in the problem-solving model. Our problem-solving model typically includes identifying the problem, really analyzing the problem, implementing a solution, and then reflecting and evaluating whether or not what we're doing is working. So when we think about how that works as part of our MTSS framework, universal screening happens, and the point of universal screening is that we're identifying students who are at risk. We implement some diagnostics. that help us to pinpoint that exact area of need. And we're going to get into this a little bit, but you're really drilling down into the data to help us use the data and information we have. And maybe you have the need to administer some additional assessments to appropriately ensure that our instruction aligns to the student's need. From there, we're actually going to determine what is the intervention that we need to be able to support the student, as again, identified by data. From there, we progress monitor and we track whether or not that intervention is working. And then again, evaluating is our last step, and that's the question we're asking: should we continue? Do we need to adjust something, or are we going to fade out the intervention? And this, again, doesn't apply just to academic needs. This is the same kind of pattern that we would use for students who have social or emotional or behavioral needs. So our diagnostic data, and I call it drill down data typically, this is the process of using multiple measures and reports to identify students' strengths and also their needs in specific skill areas so that our teachers and staff can really provide that instruction that addresses those learning needs. So if you're seeing it's all about alignment. So we need to make sure that the assessment aligns to the actual thing that we're going to do with the students. This helps our educators pinpoint the specific need that was like broadly detected through the screening process. It also guides the selection of a research-based intervention that's going to be tightly aligned to the area of need, and also then is going to be more likely to be effective. So the more precise we can be about making sure that we're confident in the level of need or the type of need, the more confident we can be that that support is going to be effective. And so the more intense the student's needs are, the more alignment we need to make sure is in place. So we spend a little bit more time aligning supports and services to students who have a greater need. If this process is skipped, we see that they can be ineffective just because we've missed that diagnostic portion. If we kind of go off of our gut and say, well, I've had kids in the past who, this intervention has seemed to work. I've had good outcomes. The more intense the student's need is, the less we should rely on those gut-based instincts. Because sometimes we're skipping the diagnostic, the true evaluation of the data to ensure that the alignment actually happens. Without that assessment, the interventions, like I said, are going to be based on familiarity, guesswork, or it's what we've always done. So taking that time to get to the specific skill gap is really going to increase the effectiveness that we see with the interventions. We don't have enough time in the year to choose those interventions that aren't really aligned. And again, the greater the need, the more alignment we should have in place. So how do we do that? So it's really important that we have multiple data points. Something that I would recommend, and actually you may have noticed I said the word data analysis team, and I had a little resource on the bottom of that slide. I learned a lot of this from Dr. Joe Kovalevsky out of Pennsylvania, and they recently just published another book called The Data-Driven School. I would really recommend you take a look at that, and they kind of break down the types of interventions that are implemented based on either being an acquisition type of intervention or proficiency intervention. So what I mean by that is if you're looking at this screen here, I'm using the example of FAST. So we've given a universal screener of A reading. From there, we've identified that some students also, they scored low. So we administered a CBM reading assessment, which is identifying the rate at which the student read. So that's one piece of the puzzle. What's really important is that we're not just looking at the rate or how quickly a student is reading. That does tell us something, but what tells us more is how accurate the student was when they actually, when they did that reading. And you can use this, by the way, for math and even for behavior. So when a student has a level of need regarding acquiring a new skill, we often see that the student is very slow and inaccurate in that skill. So we see that there are a lot of errors. And so the lower the accuracy rate is, that would be an indication that they need actual instruction in a skill area. If we see that there's a low rate, that the student is taking a long time, that just means they need more practice. So that would be where a fluency intervention would come in. And so in this case over here, you're seeing that I've basically aligned I've added the accuracy score alongside the rate score and used both of those data points to then identify which groups of kids need which type of intervention. And again, that book is The Data Driven School, and it was just released last year. It's a great read and a great resource that I would definitely recommend. Additionally, it's important that we look at multiple scores within a single measure. And if anyone uses assessments that have sub-skills, it's really important that we don't just take what that assessment told us is the area of need. We have a tendency to want to do that. I would be cautious in just using that one data point, because sometimes the number of items that are actually given to the students are maybe 4 questions, where we're gauging the entire instruction based on that. So again, the farther behind that we see a student's skill, the the more time we should be taking to ensure that there's actually a skill deficit. So when you look at a chart like this, we're actually drilled down in this case into a map, NWEA map assessment. And when you drill down, you can see from fall to winter to spring in the area of informational text how that student did. It's really important that you look at that data long term, not just the one data point, because we're looking at trends and patterns when we're looking at identifying the specific skill needs of a student. And again, the more intense, the greater the need, the more time we should be taking to align the intervention. Again, here is where we would look at that historical data. So if we're seeing that, we don't want to just say, well, they scored low on this one test this one time, let's throw them in an intervention. We should really be making sure that this is an ongoing issue and that we're taking time to ensure that the resources we're putting out there are in fact needed. Again, it's important too to think about at the individual student level, what other interventions have been put in place. So here I'm drilling down and looking at previous interventions and how the student has done. We can see that the student, was not on track for their intervention. And we can know what it is that the student had so we don't repeat that same effort. Or we can think about what did or didn't work for that intervention. So some of the keys for success that we see is that we're using, again, high quality data. Our data need to be valid, reliable, and accurate because we're making sometimes high stakes decisions based on these data points. So if we're using assessments that we aren't confident are actually measuring what they're intended to measure or haven't been shown across settings to actually measure that skill, we have a tendency to have more problems. It's also helpful to use those multiple measures and multiple data points. Using a single assessment is helpful for using class-wide supports. So again, on average, our students struggle with the concept of geometry. So therefore, as a teacher, we're going to spend a little bit more time on this skill area. For individual students, we're going to need to rely on those patterns. From there, we need to make sure that we're investing time and energy into the tools that make this process possible. So giving us the ability to drill down quickly and figure out what do we do next is really important. So sometimes we spend so much time digging through different data that we aren't being able to actually be thoughtful about what the data is showing us. So from there, we create a plan. So we're articulating the student's goal. It needs to be specific, measurable, and time-bound. We're articulating what we're going to do, what is the actual intervention strategy we're implementing, what is the duration, the frequency, and the setting location, as well as the interventionist, who is going to do the work with the student. And then we're also identifying how are we going to progress monitor the student and actually measure how the student is making progress. So, progress monitoring is this process of evaluating progress toward a performance target based on rates of improvement from frequent assessment of a specific skill. There are different ways that we can measure whether the intervention is working and if it's working fast enough. These measures should be very sensitive to growth. And what we see is there's two types of progress monitoring tools that typically exist. One is a general outcome measure, and one is a skill-based measure. So a general outcome measure is how we're tracking whether the student is actually like on track for like grade level expectations. Generally, this is where we would expect a fourth grader to be performing. We want all students to get there. The student might be so far below that we don't see progress on that general outcome measure. Therefore, it's important that we also administer a skill-based measure because that is going to actually measure the progress on a specific skill. So again, if we've got a fourth grader who we see, is really having a hard time with reading fluently, we would want to progress monitor on a specific skill as well so that we can see whether the intervention is working. Typically, the best practice is that we're alternating those two types of assessments every other week. So one week it's a general outcome measure, the other week it's a skill-based measure. You want to make sure that you're checking the alignment. The intervention should be research-based, aligned to a specific skill need. Um, it's also important to know the difference between what's a progress monitoring assessment versus an actual intervention. So DIBBLES is not the intervention. That is, or FAST is not the intervention. It's what we're doing with the student is the intervention. We're using DIBBLES or FAST to monitor the progress. And those progress monitoring tools need to be research-based, valid and reliable, designed to measure growth in that specific skill, and of course, not listed as the intervention. So LLI isn't the way that we're progress monitoring. That's the actual thing we're doing. And I'm using lots of different examples that exist. I'm not advocating for one or the other. Just want to let you know if you're hearing these terms that this is what I sometimes hear districts talking about. So how will you track fidelity? So without this process and a document or a tool for tracking these metrics, it might not happen consistently or even at all. So the questions we would want to ask is, did we do what we said we would? Are we tracking whether the students are participating in the intervention? Are we tracking whether the student is engaged when they come to the intervention? Are we tracking how often and for the length of time did we actually do the intervention? Where are we implementing the intervention within the school setting? And also thinking about who is the actual interventionist. So identifying all of those things and tracking them is really important when we get to that point of evaluating progress monitoring information. And then the last question is, did we do it the way that it was designed? So this is that treatment kind of fidelity or integrity check. And I always think about this like a recipe. So if we have, you followed this recipe and all of a sudden, no, you decided you were going to use 2 cups of flour instead, and the recipe turned out bad. Well, it wasn't the recipe's fault. I didn't do what I was supposed to. I didn't follow the recipe. I did my own thing. So if it didn't taste right, that's because I didn't do the intervention as it was intended. So anyway, just think about making sure that you're tracking what it is that you actually did with the students. And then getting to the point of evaluating effectiveness. So at the individual student level, again, this is where that intervention data analysis team comes in. We're monitoring individual students receiving those interventions to determine whether that intervention is working and whether we need to continue the intervention, change it, or have the student exit the intervention altogether. Maybe for either they exited successfully or we're doing something completely different, like a special education or referral. The typical people that we see here are a principal, again, an administrator of some sort, an interventionist, a data analyst, or a school psychologist, somebody who can really read that progress monitoring data and know what that data is telling us. These typically happen every 6 weeks for academic needs. For behavior, if you're using like check in, check out, you can use the daily point sheets as a way to monitor that progress about every 3 weeks to make decisions about these things. We're reviewing the progress monitoring data and that intervention data that I just mentioned. So, are we doing what we said we would? And are we doing it the way that it was intended? And then we're, of course, making decisions based on decision rules that we've already established. And if you haven't established them yet, at least starting here is going to give you a good starting point for you to start to think about the questions you're asking and at what cut points might you need to put in place to help you with the decision making process. Um, this shouldn't take longer than 3 minutes per student. So if you have a list of 20 kids, you can get that done in an hour. Very effectively, and you do this every 6 weeks. Of course, it goes faster if you have a system that gives you the data in a very easy, you have to be very organized when you go into those meetings to be able to get through it in 60 minutes. So one of the questions is there enough data to make a decision? So we want to have at least 6 data points for us to make a decision. And by decision, I don't mean like high stakes decisions, but we want to make sure that we have enough data to be confident in the choices that we're making about the student. Another question that's really important in this case, is there a lot of variability in the data? By that, I mean, how often are we seeing high and low scores? And at what point, if we see a lot of variability, we would be less confident in the actual scores themselves. So that might mean that the student is distracted or that the measure itself is very unreliable. So it's really important that we look at the amount of bounce that happens from one data point to another. So the closer the data points are, the more confident you can be that trend line is actually showing us true skill. And then, of course, wanting to look at how does the student's current rate of improvement compare to what we said was the goal. There's a lot that you need to know about the goal setting, but making sure that we're setting realistic goals is very important. And then I also thinking about what is the student's growth percentile? Is the student making catch-up growth? Again, going back to that concept that if they're only making average growth, that means they're going to continue to just stay at that same level because it's typical. We want to have accelerated levels of growth. So we want to see higher growth percentiles for our students. This is an example for behavior or for social emotional needs. Here you can see that over a 4 week period, 3 or 4 week period, our 80% of the points, 80% of the points that that the student had possible to earn, are they earning that consistently? So this would be kind of like for check in, check out, an example of some of the data you might have or collect. You're going to check the student plan document, and here you can make sure that are we implementing the intervention with Fidelity? And this is an example of a printout that we have. And if we are seeing that we're not implementing the intervention, why not? And we also want to make sure that the student was attending and that they were engaged. And so recording all of that information during the intervention sessions is really important. And then, of course, making and documenting your rationale. So when you're making the decisions about students, we're going to continue because, we're going to change the intervention because, fading it out. So you have all of these different things listed out, and you can use this as an example. But making sure that we're documenting why we're making the decisions so that when we come back later on, we can understand what was happening. Then lastly, when we're looking at specific interventions and that kind of evaluation overall, the program data analysis team is going to meet every 12 weeks. And again, we're trying to figure out is what we're doing for the students that we're receiving intervention, is it working? And it's not just the progress monitoring data, it's that general outcome data that we're looking at. Again, here it's a different group of people. You're typically meeting with an administrator, a school psych, or someone who knows how to analyze the data. And you're looking at that universal screening data, whether it's actual screener or attendance or behavior data, whatever it was that you looked at in the fall, if not all three of these things. And again, making sure you have those decision rules established. So here's an example. One of the questions you would want to ask is how many of our students are receiving intervention? What percentage of the population are receiving interventions? And then what percentage of the students are on track? Are at least 70% of the students on track? Are we seeing that what we're doing, that the students are responding to them? So this is another example from EduClimber, of the students who are receiving those interventions really quickly being able to see how many of them are making progress toward their goals. And then if the students aren't on track, do we know why? Over there, you'll also see that says no data entered. Well, we have people who aren't progress monitoring, or we haven't set a goal. Those are all problems with our system, and we need to make sure people are evaluating that. When we look at the overall programs that we have in place, how many interventions are we implementing? And again, what percentage of the students are receiving that intervention? And again, are at least 70% of the students receiving interventions on track? When you're looking at a specific intervention, you can actually drill down to see, making sure that you can drill down is important to see which interventions are we seeing our students responding to more often. Because that might tell us a couple different things. It might tell us that some students just aren't responding to the intervention because it's maybe not the most effective intervention. Maybe we haven't trained people appropriately on how to do the intervention. But being able to drill down into the data is really important. So in this case, I'm asking, which interventions should we scale up? Which ones should we discontinue based on the student's response to the intervention? Then the last question is, are interventions helping students catch up to grade level benchmarks? This is that general outcome measure kind of check. And again, you're using this on probably one of your screeners from the beginning of the year of the students who received intervention. How are they doing at the end of the year? Are we closing the gap? And then also taking that kind of like equity look and making sure that our practices are in fact equitable across different types of needs. Are there specific groups of students who are not responding? That leads to more questions, but it's really important we ask those questions. So overall, like I said, I have a few minutes here to answer some questions, but what we've discussed today is, what is MTSS? How does it help our team support students? It's critical that you start with Tier 1 because that's just honestly where we have the most resources allocated. And we can do a lot of great work at the Tier 1 level for students, especially if we see trends or needs at that Tier 1 level. We talked a lot about what you can do at Tier 2 and Tier 3 to be able to support the students, and then also how you can evaluate how effective the interventions are, not only at the individual student level, but also at the general intervention programming kind of level.